in doing that, and it would seem that for the most part, you agreed with some of their conclusions. You had concerns that some of their opinions were not really well-based in fact. For instance, their opinions about Constellation seem to be poorly based in fact because they didn't do much work around Constellation. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. Beyond that, as part of your evaluation, you determined that the data that they used about the West Beverly Hills lineament as it relates to the high school was actually wrong, that they had inferred data, and that as we subsequently explored that by trenching, all the assumptions that they had created based on their limited data at the time, you think probably are not true.
Let me bring Dean up here to talk about going from what Metro did as their study to what fault trenching will do.
Okay.
So I think that Metro's consultant used techniques which are state of the practice for areas of congestion like we see in Century City. And without access to large open areas, it's very difficult to dig fault trenches, which are the accepted, for the most part, the accepted best practice method for looking at active faults and their effects at this near surface. They took the data that they had and they made interpretations that I would say I probably would not have made. Were they're incorrect interpretations? I don't know if that they're incorrect. But I think by studying the faults using fault trenching techniques as opposed to geophysical techniques and just borings, you get a better picture.
One is in your page 6, where you actually quote the directive on page 1 of the fault report states that, this is quote, Metro staff was directed to fully investigate the nature and locations of faults in the Century City area and their potential impact on the proposed station locations. Based on this that's end quote, based on this directive, we do not believe the West Beverly Hills lineament and the Constellation Station were fully investigated, particularly when compared with the studies performed at Santa Monica Station. That's from your report. So that in point of fact, they actually haven't even completed the assignment. This remains an incomplete assignment based on that statement.
I would say that was the conclusion that we made, yes.
There was a question or a comment you had made that that you relied on the school district's analysis of the trenching, and which determined that, or is likely to determine that there's not an active fault there, correct?
Correct. We had, just to clarify, we did have Dr. Roy Schleman observe those trenches, but not on basically on an observation basis, not a full-time basis.
Okay, so then my follow-up to that is, does Shannon and Wilson have an opinion as to whether, from your expert observation, the analysis or pending recommendation from the school districts would be the same as that coming from Shannon and Wilson about no active faults?
Based on our discussions with Dr. Schleman and his opinions, we concur that there is no active faults in the trenches at the high school.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
Could you go back to the original eastern alignment that they were looking at? Because you raised the issue of if those faults are there or not, where along the West Beverly Hills lineament. Right. So that alignment, assuming all of those faults are not there, entrenching is the best way to establish that, what would preclude the establishment of a station exactly where it is on that diagram? Because it would seem the main concern there is the potential faulting along the West Beverly Hills lineament.
That's correct, and that's an excellent point.
So
if those faults aren't there, there really is less of a reason or potentially no reason as to why we couldn't locate the station.
So we don't even have to, as was discussed, go further east. Dr. Piotr Monsarz indicated that there are methane, a high concentration of gassy ground and methane, especially around, there was actually a name for the field. I forget what the name was, along Constellation. Does that conform to your understanding of the geology of the area?
Yes, it does. They, in fact, had test holes in the area of the Constellation Station that picked up fairly high concentrations of methane.
Right. Now, I understand that Metro has said, we got a letter from Art Leahy, which I think was read. You probably have seen it, Art Leahy, CEO of Metro. That was read, I believe, where he says, don't worry, we can deal with methane. You addressed potential ways of doing that. But I'm struggling to understand how, if methane is not a problem at all, why they would have moved the interim transit station from Fairfax to La Cienega due to specific concerns regarding methane.
I don't have any input on that. We haven't reviewed that move or those stations.
So, but does it make sense to you that high concentrations of methane would present a problem at one location, and would cause you to perhaps even move a station or move an interim station, and yet where you also have high levels of methane, it's not an issue? Because it clearly, here it doesn't seem to be an issue. Fairfax it does. I'm not a scientist. I'm struggling to understand why, on the one hand, is it no problem, easy peasy? Why, on the other hand, is it a serious issue, so much so that they're going to have to actually go to the extreme step of moving an interim transit station?
I couldn't comment on that. There could be other reasons, economic, use of the station, a whole bunch of things.
Okay.
We did do work at the LACMA Museum. There's high methane concentrations there as well.
Sure.
And that was handled by using impermeable PVC membranes around the excavation to block out the methane and take care and block it out away from the used portions, the offices.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that you've again shared with us that the Metro data around the high school is not accurate based on the data that Exponent had and that you actually saw when you were actually looking in the trench itself, or Dr. Schliemann was actually looking in the trench itself. And it's, again, confirming that the Constellation route, Metro doesn't have enough data, it sounds like, to make a safe recommendation that this is where you should have or could have a station stop for a variety of reasons that you've outlined. I guess, Councilmember Gold said before that his take was that we don't have enough information. I guess my take is that Metro actually doesn't have enough information to make a rational decision about not going on Santa Monica, and with their flawed data around the high school in terms of activity of faults and the questions at Constellation, they don't have enough data to decide that a Constellation stop is even safe and right to do based on this limited data. So I guess what we are really owed from Metro is more information, more data, and some real science to assess the fault line on Santa Monica Boulevard and determine what's real and what is not real and what's active and what's not active, since clearly to date their data is not bearing out what they had sent out in their final EIR and their prior draft EIR.